everybody. Welcome to SmartHER News. As you know, I have a antithetical relationship with political polling. As I've mentioned repeatedly on SmartHER News, I think it's really important to provide quick, concise, nonpartisan information. And polls can be really tricky because I find them to be purely a picture of the past and not necessarily that something that's particularly helpful looking at the future, although they can be. And we're going to leave room for that conversation today, because we have a bit of a celebrity joining us. Because as you know, if there's any poll that I do reference, it's constantly and consistently RealClear Politics. And Tom Bevan is the co-founder of RealClear Politics. And I want him actually to give you the backstory about how they came up with the RealClear Politics polling average, which is what I really rely on. But more than anything else, Tom provides great insights into the world of politics. And I've always really enjoyed his website. And Tom, the reality is that, did you know that RealClear Politics actually was a little bit of an inspiration for SmartHER News?
I did not know that. That's very flat.
Yes. You know, it always has been. I've used it throughout my career because it's a great place to go just to see a variety of different articles with different perspectives all in one place. And then, of course, you have the polls, which we definitely want to get to. Here we are. I just want to set the stage. We're talking just under 2 weeks away from Election Day. And everyone's looking to tell the future in some way, shape, or form to get some sort of certainty in an uncertain time. But before we get into that, can you just tell me a little bit of the backstory? Did you grow up thinking, you know what, political polling is my destiny?
Not at all. I mean, one of the things about RealClear Politics is that neither the co-founder, John McIntyre, nor myself were involved in politics or journalism professionally. He was a trader. We met in Chicago. We went to school together, actually. We graduated from Princeton the same year, but didn't really know each other in college. We met in Chicago via some mutual friends after that. And I was in advertising, and as I said, he was trading. But we had this shared affinity for politics. We were just junkies, right? We would listen to the Sunday shows, watch the Sunday shows, and listen to talk radio, and grab the newspaper and flip open to the op-ed page. And so it was sort of the mid to late 90s when we had this aha moment, which was you could read what was being written in the LA Times and the New York Times on the same day. And we thought, why don't we create a place for political junkies and just bring all this information together? Op-eds, news stories, video clips, whatever we could get our hands on. And then eventually that sort of grew into the poll average, which we created, and we're sort of innovators in that space. And that's how a lot of people came to learn about RealClear Politics. The poll average, the RCP poll averages sort of broke through in the 2004 election, and we started getting on TV, and people were referencing them, and so that's when we quit our day jobs and went to do this full time. But it was not something that we ever thought when we started out, that we would have this company that 20 years later would be right in the middle of one of the most contentious presidential races and the closest that we've ever seen.
Isn't that funny when you look back on things and think, wow, where I started is not where I've ended up, and I have no idea what direction this is going in next, but we're along for the ride. Yeah. How did the RealClear Politics average come about? And can you explain a little bit of the science behind it? I know it's probably highly confidential, but
it's actually not. I mean, that's the thing about it. I mean, we just do a straight average. Now, we've got tons of competitors and imitators and folks but they all, they're all adjusting the polls, and they're weighting them, and based on, past track record, or whether they think they're Republican leaning or Democrat leaning, or whether they're the most recent or they're a couple days old or whatever. And they have all their secret sauce and black boxes and all that. We just put the numbers, they're right there for everyone to see. And it's a simple average. It is not complicated. And the idea behind it was, when we started getting a sort of proliferation of polls heading into the 2004 election, you'd get a poll that would say, John Kerry's up 4 points, and another poll that said, George W. Bush is up 3 points. Well, which one's correct? It's a pretty simple idea that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. All of these polls have margin of error. All of them involve, some level of deciding what the electorate's going to look like, and all of that. And so when you aggregate the polls, you get a better sense of where the race stands at any given point in time. And to the point that you made earlier, or just as importantly, which way is the race heading? Where's the trend line? Is it going up for a candidate or down? And so I mentioned John McIntyre, my co-founder. He had a background in finance, and we sort of envision the RCP average as the Dow Jones of the political world, right? Individual stocks, they go up, they go down during the day. But at the end of the day, people want to know, what did the market do? What did the Dow do? That's the number that gets reported. Same thing with political polls. So you got 3 or 4 polls that come out in a day. They all say different things. Some are going up, some are going down. But at the end of the day, what's the RealClear Politics average say? And which direction is that heading in? And so we shared our poll data with everybody, anybody who would pick it up. We did deals with everybody from the Wall Street Journal to USA Today, Yahoo News, and just try to get them out there. And that's how we sort of became the gold standard of poll averages and have been, doing it ever since.
So, Tom, is it fair to say that I'm just going to use let's use baking terms. I'm actually not a very good cook, so this is not good, right? I'm not a bad baker. So, is the RealClear Politics average sort of like tossing everything into the bowl and mixing it all up and then seeing what comes out?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, again, we just produce a straight average, so we're not sort of, putting our finger on the scale for any one poll. And the idea is that, all of that stuff will come out in the wash. And if you have a poll that's an outlier, it's mitigated by the fact that you've got 8 other polls in the average. And obviously, the more data you get, the smaller margin of error that you would get. Right? If you instead of looking at 500 respondents, you've got 10 polls of 500 respondents each. Suddenly, you've got 5,000 people that you're looking at. So that is the sort of general idea, and it has been honestly a very, very effective tool. Now there is, there's the garbage in, garbage out theory. If all the polls are saying one thing, and the results are something else, then obviously our average is going to represent that. And we saw that in 2016. In Wisconsin, for example, and some other states. We saw it again in 2020. The national polls, our final average was, I think, 7.2 for Joe Biden. He won by 4.5. So at the national level, they polls overestimated Biden's support by, a good couple points. So yeah, it depends on what's in the average. But again, historically, you look back over time, and poll averages have been our poll average has been one of the most accurate and effective tools in sort of seeing where a race is and eventually predicting the outcome.
So just looking back on the elections that you have now been a part of through RealClear Politics, how does this election compare to others? What makes it different?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, this race actually is looking a lot to me like 2016 in a lot of ways. But it is very close. I mean, it's probably closer than any race leading into it that we've seen. Now, that may not be the outcome. In 2 weeks, we could find ourselves with a decisive victory in one direction or another. And certainly, 2016 was close. 2020, despite the fact that Biden won, by 7 million votes in the popular vote, it was actually closer in the electoral college. It was 40,000 votes in 3 states. You flip those votes, and Joe Biden's not president. So the last couple elections have been close, but this one leading into it, I mean, we're tracking these 7 battleground states, and Donald Trump is currently leading in all of them, but in 4 of the 7, he's leading by less than a percentage point. And that's closer than any of the pre-election polling that we saw in 2020 or 2016.
So what are you watching for? What's the indicator that you find yourself waking up in the morning and looking at?
Well, I mean, at this point in the race, when we're this close, right, you want to see whether there's movement, upward movement, which would mean that independents and late deciders, the small portion of the public that is still undecided, whether they're going to break, in one direction or another. And what's interesting about this campaign is, traditionally, undecideds, if they get right down to it, they'll traditionally break for the challenger, right, against the incumbent. But this time around, you've got Kamala Harris, who's sort of a quasi-incumbent. I mean, she's part of the current administration, but trying to present herself as turning a new page and being a different type of leader. And then you've got Donald Trump, who already was the incumbent and now wants his old job back. So it's a little bit different than what we've seen, in past. It may not be as clear cut as, we've seen Undecided's breaking the past. So that's going to be something that's interesting to watch. And again, this is the time when a lot of voters, those final holdouts are finally telling pollsters what their decision is.
That's one of the questions we get a lot from our audience. Who actually gets polled? Because a lot of our audience is like, I never got a poll. I didn't get a call. No one's texting me.
Yeah.
It brings up that question, like, who is actually getting polled? How would you answer that, Tom?
I mean, we get emails like that all the time. I'm 75 years old. I've never been polled since polls are all bogus. It's a big country. There are a lot of people. And these polls at the state level, they're doing, 400, 500, 600 respondents. At the national level, it's 8, 9, 1,000 respondents maybe. So there are, and the thing that pollsters have been doing now is trying to, use multimodal, different modes to make sure that they're getting a representative sample of the country. So they're using text messages now, certainly, cell phones. It used to be all landlines. It's not that anymore. Online panels, trying to reach people that way. So, but I get that question all the time. And all I can tell you is that, all of the pollsters that we've talked to, I mean, they are doing the work. They are making phone calls and people are getting polled, but there are an awful lot of people out there who don't get those calls. And I don't know if they're mad about it or just curious as to why they haven't been polled, but there are a lot of people out there who haven't gotten a call from it.
I think you said something really important there, though, that some of the polls that we're seeing, it's probably something good to be aware of. Some of the polls that could be on the front page of, let's say, a major newspaper, we're talking about a sample size of a few hundred to a few thousand voters. Is that typical?
That is typical. And look, this is where polling is still, it's a science, but it's also an art, right? Because once you gather your respondents and you've got people who've told you, okay, I've got 1,000 people and they told me how they're going to vote. And then you have to make educated guesses about what's the electorate going to look like on November 5th. How many young voters am I going to have? How many women? How many men? How many African Americans? How many Hispanics? And how do you go about doing that, right? Well, they do it a couple different ways. One is to go back and look at what the electorate looked like 4 years ago, 8 years ago, and make projections. But that's not always good enough. And the other question that pollsters ask about voters, right, when they're trying to divine their intent is, how likely are you to vote? And they'll say, have you voted in the past election? Sometimes they'll give them a scale of 1 to 10, and they'll say, I'm only people who are considered an 8, 9, or 10 are considered likely voters, and then go in that sample. So they're using all these different techniques to try and figure out exactly who's going to be turning out on November 5th. And that's where, at the end of the day, some of them will get it right and some of them will get it wrong. But we can't possibly know which pollsters are going to be the most accurate until after all those votes are counted.
Hence the reason for RealClear Politics Average. So it's a great, and that's why I really turn to it as such a great tool. I'm curious your thoughts just quickly about the undecideds, and then I'd love to get into a couple more specific questions about just swing states and what you're seeing as different paths to victory. But when we're talking about undecided voters, are we talking about people that haven't made up their mind about a candidate, or are we talking about people that haven't decided if they're actually going to vote?
So that's a great question because honestly, if you're undecided at this point with these candidates, there might be a good chance that you just will, stay home. If you go back, there was a group that got a lot of publicity early on in the year called the double haters.
Yes, I did a whole segment on the double haters. What's a great term? I want a T-shirt. I feel like that's one of the big terms coming from this election period.
Yes. So the double haters are people who view both candidates unfavorably. Pollsters will ask the question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of Donald Trump? And at the time, it was Joe Biden. And the people who viewed both candidates unfavorably are called double haters. And in January, I think the New York Times Siena poll had it at 19% of the electorate. So basically 1 in 5 people out there said, I don't like either of these people. Now, when Joe Biden was replaced, a lot of Democrats who had reservations about him over his age or his mental fitness or whatever, who had parked their vote with RFK Jr. or one of the other third-party candidates, came home. And I think that double hater number now is down significantly from where it was. And I think that compromises most of the folks who are undecided at this point. I mean, if you're really struggling with who to vote for, you probably don't like your choices. and you're not feeling great about either candidate. And so, and again, to your point, I think some of those folks will stay home. And then the question is, well, who is going to win the majority of the other folks? Because if some of these states are decided, if it is as close as the polls suggest, some of these states will be decided as they were in 2020 by, 5, 10,000, 11,000, 15,000, 20,000 votes. And that, if we're talking about 1 or 2% of the electorate, it could be significant.
That's so, just thinking about those numbers, you're talking about anywhere from the difference of a big high school to a pretty major college. The population there being the difference in who wins and loses. And when you think about it like that, it just gives you an idea of just how close the races have been. And I wonder if there's a different candidate down ballot, there's a senator you want to vote to that gets you to the polls. And then even if you don't feel inspired by the presidential candidates, you just check one because you're there. Why not? Or if there, or if there's a different, strategy for some voters. What do you think is the most undercovered story in the political landscape? Do you see a story that you still feel like the media is missing?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like I live in this stuff every single day, reading everything and seeing as much as I can. I feel like the press has they've covered a lot about Kamala Harris and her struggles with the traditional Democratic base, right? Latinos, African Americans, particularly men. The gender gap's been covered. Young voters have been covered. I think the one thing that probably gets a little bit less coverage is that Donald Trump has been polling this entire year way better than he did in 2020, way better than he did in 2016, right? And we keep track of we have a thing on the site where we actually list, here's today's numbers. And then here's what the numbers were on this exact day 4 years ago and 8 years ago. And you can see it's rather dramatic. I mean, both Clinton and Biden were leading at this point nationally by 6 to 8 points. And Kamala Harris is up, 0.2% in our national average right now. So, and it's the same situation in the swing states. And, that hasn't probably gotten as much coverage. I think people who follow it closely recognize it, but it certainly isn't necessarily portrayed like that in the media.
What does it mean to you?
Well, I mean, I think it means that Trump has a higher ceiling than he did in 2016 and 2020. He has, despite the fact, and obviously there's a lot that goes into this. There's been the indictments and the assassinations attempts and all of those things. I mean, but he has emerged in some ways stronger than ever. And part of that is that the number one issue that voters tell us, is their top concern is the economy and inflation. And, voters look at the current administration and see, while inflation has come down, it's still, 20, 25% higher, a lot of things, groceries in particular, than they were when this administration took office. And people are thinking fondly of the Trump era on the economy. They still might not like his mean tweets or the way he talks, or some of the things he does. But on that issue, he has an advantage. It's the number one issue this year.
Let's talk a little bit about just when people talk about paths to victory. What do they mean, Tom? And what do you see as the necessary parts of the paths to victory for the Democrats and the Republicans? Are they the same or are they party specific?
Well, I mean, when we talk about paths to victory, we're usually talking about the electoral college, right? And because we don't have national election, we have state by state election, and you got to get to 270. That's the goal. And when you look at the map, as I mentioned, there are only 7 states that are really in play. You might be able to suggest that, if Trump has a good night, that maybe Virginia or New Hampshire or Minnesota might be in play. Kamala Harris has a good night. Maybe there's a chance that a red state ends up going blue. But overall, it's these 7 states, and we're tracking those obviously very closely. For Kamala Harris, just in the last 10 days, Trump's got a little bit of separation from her in Georgia. He leads in our RCP average in Georgia by about 2.5 points. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll just came out, had him up 4, I think. So he seems to have gotten a little separation there. Same thing in Arizona. He's up almost 2 points in our average. And so the Sun Belt is looking like it's not a very fruitful path for Kamala Harris, which is why she's touring the upper Midwest. I mean, if she wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she wins the election, 270 to 268. It would be that close. And so I think that the other interesting piece of this, the wild card is North Carolina, because you have a whole bunch of stuff going on there. Number one, recent polls show Kamala Harris leading there. You got the aftermath of the Hurricane Helene, a lot of those western counties that were devastated. They voted heavily for Trump in 2020 and 16. And the question is, can all of those folks get their ballots in? Or will some of them, will that, keep his numbers down in those counties? And by the way, Asheville voted for Biden by, I think, 20 points or something. So there's concern on the Democratic side too. And then you've got this governor's race, Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate, sort of scandal that happened there. So there's a lot happening in North Carolina that has made that picture very sort of volatile and murky. If Kamala Harris is able to win North Carolina, it's 16 electoral votes. So it gives her some wiggle room to lose Michigan or Wisconsin. But why everybody's focused on Pennsylvania is because it's 19 electoral votes. So if you lose Pennsylvania, you can't just replace it with another state. You have to win 2 states. And that brings me to the last state, which is Nevada, which is a state that Democrats have traditionally done very well. I think our poll average in 2016 had Trump winning that state. He lost it by 2.5 points. Biden won it again in 2020 by 2.5 points. And on the strength of sort of the culinary unions and the remnants of Harry Reid's machine out there. But this time around, it seems like it's much more competitive. And because of, again, Latino men in particular that have moved towards Trump, that state is very, very close. And so I think Harris, as a backup, she's fighting for that one as well. But those are the paths to victory. For her, it's pretty much the upper Midwest now, unless she's able to win North Carolina. And Trump has multiple paths. I mean, with the Sun Belt, if he can win those states, he's definitely got the advantage.
So if he wins Georgia with Florida, then that gives him a big advantage about what swing states he has to win next. Is that kind of what you're looking at as like a tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, Florida is it's going to be Republican, I think. I mean, Democrats have based on what we saw in 20 and 2022 when it moved rather dramatically. I think Democrats haven't really spent a bunch of time and effort there because they think that it's just not doable at this point. So I put that solidly in sort of the Republican column. But Georgia, 16 electoral votes. Arizona's another 11. And obviously the Trump folks feel good about North Carolina, but it's going to be close, I think. And with all of those states, he just has to win one of those upper Midwest states, right? He would just win, if he wins Pennsylvania, where they're heavily focused and he's ahead, that would do it for him. Pennsylvania is really the linchpin and the tipping point of this election.
And that's really good just to underscore. It's the linchpin, even though it's a small state on the map, you got a lot of electoral votes. And it's that number, Tom, that's so important to all the campaigns. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, as I said, you can't replace it with any of the other battleground states. You'd have to win 2. And so that's why, I mean, the campaigns have basically been living there. I mean, they're just doing everything they can to win those votes in Pennsylvania. And again, it's close, but Trump certainly has a slight edge there, according to the latest polling data.
A few weeks ago, I saw some different headlines that were suggesting that we could see an electoral tie.
Ah, yes.
Is that possible?
The elusive tie. Well, yeah, and we talk about it because it would be crazy, right? It would be a huge story. And yes, it is, you can concoct, I think it's a very, very low probability, but you can certainly play with a map and come up with scenarios where it's a 269 tie. And obviously, if you want to see heads explode around the country,
I don't know if I want to see it, Tom.
To the House of Representatives, where the delegations from each state would vote to select the president of the United States. And right now, that would mean Donald Trump would win because Republicans have a majority in those states.
It's right, and so that's important. It's those that are sitting in Congress now that would determine that, not anybody new that would be coming in. Right. So you could, okay. That's good. Just to prepare. I don't want anything exploding.
It's a low probability event, but again, I mean, you can't rule anything out at this point. I mean, I always tell people my theory of the case is that, it's Murphy's Law plus, Occam's razor plus the chaos theory. Whatever the craziest thing you can imagine that would happen, it's probably going to happen, and it might even be worse than that. I mean, just imagine the things that we've seen over the last few weeks with Biden dropping out, assassination attempts. I mean, it's been like 4 campaigns in one just in the last 3 months.
It's actually a lot to digest when you step back, and I think that's why many of us probably haven't paused quite yet. We just think, let's get through the election, because when you really try to sort through it and you really realize what's happened over the last couple of months, no wonder we're all exhausted.
Yeah.
Let alone,
Is, people thought the drama was going to be in the primaries, right? Ron DeSantis was going to challenge Trump, and that didn't go anywhere. I mean, it just fizzled out right away. Trump locked that thing up early, and then the Democrats really went out of their way to protect Joe Biden. I mean, they changed the primary calendar in his favor. They ran RFK Jr. out of the party. I mean, they really ensured that he would not face a serious, credible challenge, and so there was no drama in the primary on either side for months and months, and then all hell broke loose on June 27th.
Right, absolutely. It's such a condensed period of time. Let me say 2 names to you.
Okay.
And then I want to hear what you think about them and how they may affect the race. Jill Stein and Chase Oliver. I'm talking about the candidate for the Green Party and the candidate for the Libertarian Party. Every election cycle, some of these candidates, despite the fact that they get no coverage and they're constantly told they can never win, which in this case looks to be the case. I never like to say that, Tom, because it feels just weird to, even though it's obvious that we have 2 major parties. I saw that on RealClear Politics too in your mission statement, that you don't believe anyone really holds, that dominates what the public can think. And so I think it's important that even we mention their names because they are in the ballot and they do represent certain parties and certain voters, and they do get some votes. And in such a tight election, I wonder what the effect of either of these candidates could be in certain states. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, don't forget Randall Terry of the Constitution Party and Cornel West, right? They're on the ballot.
I apologize. Yes, exactly.
Look, Democrats are still smarting over Jill Stein in 2016 because she ended up costing Hillary Clinton, a couple of states there, and she didn't get a lot of votes. And it absolutely is the case that it could happen again. And we've seen RFK, right, fought to get on all these ballots and then suspended his campaign and tried to, and Democrats sued him every single time to keep him off the ballot. And then once he got on, he suspends his campaign and he wants his name taken off the ballot, and then Democrats sue to keep him on. And so he is going to be on the ballot in a couple of these states. And how might that affect Donald Trump's support in those states versus the Jill Steins or the Cornel West voters that most likely are going to take away from Kamala Harris? Again, we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. I can tell you, though, when you look at the polling data, they're Chase Oliver, Jill Stein, Cornel West, they're all under 1%. 0.8% here, 0.8% there in our average. But again, you add them up and you're talking about 3% of the voting population. And if some of these states are going to be decided by 10,000 votes, they could end up having an impact. But we won't know that until I was going to say the day after election. We may not even know that, actually. Have to wait to see.
They're saying a couple days after the election. What are your thoughts with, Beyonce, for example? There's reports today as we're sitting here, by the time anyone hears this may have already happened, that she's holding a concert in Houston and she's going to be performing for Kamala Harris. And then you had Eminem with former President Obama. And how much do these events impact? Do you see any changes in the numbers? Do you see any demonstrable data? Because we might see a lot of different things over the next week and a half or so that actually changes anything. Celebrity or appearances or any of it? No,
I mean, Beyonce held a concert. Beyonce and Jay-Z held a big concert for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Bruce Springsteen held big concerts for, I think, John Kerry and others. It never ends up making any difference. It always gets a lot of publicity, but it never ends up making any difference. Even Taylor Swift, right? There is some evidence.
Even Taylor Swift.
that she got a lot of young, probably women, to register to vote. But did it move the needle in a national race? No. There's no evidence support that theory. And in some ways, again, these endorsements, depending on who they are and how they come out, they actually could work against Kamala Harris, because the average voter would look at that and be like, oh, these Hollywood elites and they're trying to tell me what to do and who to vote for, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that could risk, a backlash among working class voters in some of these states that she's trying to win. And so I'm not at all convinced that this is going to do anything to help her. It'll be a huge news story and there'll be a lot of coverage of it and whatnot. But in terms of, I doubt it's going to help her. There's no evidence to suggest it's going to help her. And in some cases, it might even hurt her a little bit.
That's an interesting point. I'm going to bring you back just briefly here as we close up. I have two final questions for you. This one is pretty specific, because I was thinking about, well, what events have happened ahead of an election where there has been an argument that maybe it impacted voters in a real way and it was substantial. And what comes to mind, of course, is James Comey, the FBI director, reopening an investigation into Hillary Clinton a couple days before the election. And there's been plenty of pontification about that over the years and if it affected and we don't need to go back all the way back to that. It was just an example. I guess the question is, what are you looking for, Tom? For if it's not celebrity endorsements, if it's not an attempted assassination, I mean, we've had these huge variety of different events and we're wondering what is that impacts voters. What do you see it as, that thing that you are watching for? And it may not be something that we're all keeping an eye on, that you think, wait, that something like that, something along these lines, that could be a difference maker.
I honestly don't know. It's impossible to predict the future, but I have to say there's hardly anything at this point that, because again, remember, we're 2 weeks out. A lot of people have already voted. We've seen a lot of the early voting numbers. I mean, the election's been going on in some states for 3 or 4 weeks now. And a lot of the people that are waiting to vote or are going to vote on election day have already made up their minds, and they're not going to be swayed, particularly if it's a sort of gotcha type news story that comes out. And we've seen a couple of those in recent days. Voters aren't going to believe them. I think particularly if they're stories against Donald Trump, Republican voters are going to be like, I've seen all this, and I've seen they've done worse. They're not going to believe it. So now, could there be like a terror event? Yes. That scrambles the political calculus here, maybe. But again, this election, the sort of backdrop to this election has, as we say in the business, the cake has been baked, to go back to your baking metaphors, right?
Thank you.
It's been in the oven for a long time, and it's pretty much done at this point. I'm not sure there's a whole lot out there that can show up in the last couple of weeks that's going to move this electorate. Now, you go back and think, that is not the case. You go back and think to 2000, right? It was the George W. DUI, the weekend before the election, that apparently moved enough voters to make that a basically dead heat. You just think about it now, like if it came out that Trump got a DUI like 20 years ago, which he doesn't even drink, so it's not a possibility, or that Kamala Harris got a DUI 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we wouldn't even think twice. I mean, that would be like, that's a nothing burger, right? This is so different for a lot of reasons that I'm just not sure there's a whole lot out there that is going to move the needle in one direction or another here in the last couple of weeks. I could be wrong. You never know. But that's just kind of my sense of where things stand.
Yeah, it's interesting social commentary of our shock metric. We're like, we've tolerated so much at this point that we wonder what it could be. And we don't want to, it's not a dare, somebody knock on wood, because we're not looking for that. But yes. Okay, final question here. Sort of serious, sort of not serious. What does like a Tom Bevan do on election night? Like, do you have a popcorn? Do you have like a special margarita? Like, how do you go about it? And what is it that you're like, this is the one thing that I'm keeping an eye on? Just a little insight. We promise not to recreate RealClear politics, but yeah, give us a little, walk us through the day for you, Tom. How does it look?
Well, election days are, I was going to say they're one of my least favorite days. And the reason is because you just sit there all day and wait. And you're checking the news feeds and trying to get us, and you'll see stories, turnout's big over here, turnout's big over there. But there's nothing that can be done. So you just kind of sit there all day in anticipation. And it's a little bit frustrating. So I will make some news for you, Jenna. This year, we're actually going to be doing a live stream on our site of our podcast. So myself, Andrew Walworth, and Carl Cannon will be live on RealClear Politics, calling the election and talking about, and we'll have Sean Trendy, our senior elections analyst, there, and just sort of talking through what we're seeing, which will be fun. We've never done that before. We're looking forward to it. It should be exciting. And the other thing I'd say is, the good news is for people who are into this stuff is that, Virginia in particular, right, is an early close state. I think the first two states are Indiana and Kentucky. How much will we be able to tell if Donald Trump wins those by a point or two more or less than he won, 4 years ago or 8 years ago? Probably not so much. But Virginia is a state that Joe Biden was losing to Donald Trump before he dropped out of the race. Kamala Harris, when she got in, she took the lead back from Trump, but it's close. It's about, I think the polling there is about 5 points. They won that state. Joe Biden won that state by 10 points. And so Virginia's going to close on the early side, will be one of the first states to close. And if that race is close, too close to call when the polls close, or it's a 3-point victory for Harris or a 2-point victory for Harris, that will be an early tell that Donald Trump is going to have, and the Republicans most likely are going to have a really good night. Conversely, if she wins it by 10 or 12 or whatever, that would be a sign that, hey, Democrats are coming out in droves, and that would be a good sign for the Harris campaign. So I will tell your listeners and viewers, keep an eye on Virginia.
Oh, that's a hot tip. I love it. Honestly, it is so overwhelming when you get to that point of the news cycle. You just pray for some clarity. Because as the hours tick on and the polls close and you still don't have any results, it's a little bit of a dance. So I'm excited. I'll totally tune in. I'm into RealClear Politics. I'm going to be there, Tom. So if you need like a Texas court, listen. You send me out on the streets, Tom. We're gonna get. We'll do it. I think that's exciting. I think it's going to be a very interesting story to cover. Regardless, and whatever happens, whatever the outcome is, and it's history making again, whatever the outcome is, and I'm glad to be able to watch it along with you guys. So, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and thank you for RealClear Politics. It's a great resource, and I value it so much, and the media landscape is better for having it. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it.
Thank you for believing in quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news. Every time you join us or share or save our content, you help us build a solution in news, and we are so grateful. We have a few other ways you can support our mission, from joining our insider community scoop, to shopping our gear at our SmartHER shop, to just telling a friend. The best way to do any of this is to visit smarternews.com or follow us at SmartHER News on social media. Don't worry, we put all of this in the captions so it's easy for you. Plus, we added our email just in case you want to drop us a note. We always love hearing from you. Thank you for helping us deliver news smarter.